Hi and welcome to today's session. I'm Cornelius Murray, and in this session I will be taking you through the Australian Prudential Standard CPS 234. And if you find this informative and you would like to have a deeper conversation, then please feel free to reach out and we'll see how we can assist you further. Now, when looking at business, we understand there's a couple of components, right? You want to make money, save money, and we also need to reduce risks. Now, if you look at what William Miller mentioned, he said 5 things to consider on what creates value for business. It's your return on investment, it is your time, it's risk, it's leverage, and it's your brand and image. So looking at that, not following regulation can have a negative impact on these requirements on your business outcomes. So if you want to sum up the prudential regulation in one sentence, it is a type of financial regulation that requires financial firms to control risk. So a couple of things we will be covering off. It is going to be around the changes due to CPS 234. We will have a look at how this will impact your security strategy. We will look at some of the considerations, the workflows, and also some important frameworks that you can follow within your business to help you with those requirements. So there are various reasons to have clearly defined roles and responsibilities. And this is one of the components that the Prudential Standard is also talking about. So the first thing is going to be around responsibilities. They then talk about the information security capability. And that will then flow over to the controls that needs to be implemented. And then an important part for them is around the notification. How do you notify APRA when there is a breach? So we'll be talking about this around the key objectives and the implementations as well. Now, yes, this is not an easy task, but you can follow some basic principles to help to simplify these requirements. So looking at business innovation, it's quite important to look at the business drivers and also how you will deliver those components around through there. Because the one important thing that we've seen now is we know that cyber risk can no longer be an afterthought. The board of directors, according to CPS 234, are now going to be held accountable. So with this, when it comes to the things that we all have, it's going to be around compliance and regulations. And that is where having a framework is going to be important that can help you to mitigate the risk. So even from a global landscape perspective, we have different requirements that we need to follow. And this is also true that there might be an overlap in some of these frameworks and regulations requirements, but we still need to address these components from a CPS 234 framework perspective. But looking at what they've done, and I think this is quite key, is that 56% of breaches took months or longer to discover. And by looking at some of the costs, especially if, from the healthcare and the FSI perspective, you can see why it's important to have something in place to say, how can we mitigate and reduce those risks as much as possible. But look at the financial regulation that requires the financial firms to control risk. Is we need to go and have a look at, we're going to have to look at what is CPS 234. So that was released in 2019 for review. It was implemented on the 1st of July in 2019. And for the third parties, it's going to be applicable in 2020. So looking at the previous slides, one can understand the need for regulation. And it makes sense why APRA created these standards. So what can we expect to see? We will see the objectives, the tools that should be in place for businesses to be prepared, and also how to respond. And this became effective since last year, the 1st of July, 2019. So one of the components that we've seen also is that the standard is broad. Let's also focus on the resilience against cyber security incidents and cyber attacks. We will also be talking about risk buy down, and that is how much money should you spend to bring down your risk to an acceptable level. So one of the components that the report is also talking about is the capability that should be corresponding to the size or degree in proportion. Kind of what does that mean sometimes? But also the controls that is regularly tested at least once a year. Would recommend at least twice a year to be tested, but the report is saying at least once a year. And then also notifications for APRA on the date of breaches when there is an incident. It went from a couple of days down to 72 hours, and also 10 days if a process or vulnerability can't be fixed in time. So when we look at this, we talk about this, responsibilities is going to be important. The key aspect is that the board of directors are now going to be held accountable for it. If you look at the information security capability, you kind of have to understand what that means, right? Because sometimes this seems to be a very vague policy, but there are some clear controls in what they are looking for. So this can be a great policy and a great standard to help improve cybersecurity and also reduce your risk within business. So looking at the key objective is to minimize the likelihood and impact of information security incidents. And they also talk a lot about the CIA in the policy, and that is around the confidentiality, integrity, and authentication of the information assets. And there are also some other statements that will have to be included when it comes to the key requirements. So when looking at the implementation of controls, that is to protect the information assets, and it undertakes systematic testing and assurance regarding the effectiveness of those controls to confirm the effectiveness of those tools. And this will help you with the framework that you will have in place, where you can measure the success and then rate your tools you've implemented. And that is where frameworks such as NIST comes in very handy. And then also look at ITIL, for example, to look at some of the processes that you might need in your business. So hey, one important aspect is, if you have the process in place, run through the risk management framework where you can have a look at the process, because you can use this then to monitor the impact on business and analyze the impact and document any required changes and see how you can respond or make changes to resolve any issues to help improve the process on reporting where there is a data or when there is a data breach. So the policy referenced a couple of times to information assets, but what does it mean? So the information assets means information and information technology, including things such as software, hardware, and data. Now the data can be both soft copy and hard copy, but also processes and data, right? You also need to have visibility on third-party services and how that interconnects with the business information assets. And it's important to make sure that you have controls in place for that. So is this standard then only for financial services? Not necessarily. This is also applicable if your business is providing a service to those FSIs who are accountable to APRA. So one of the components that we hear quite often is the but how. And this is really important to provide assurance to your client via independent auditors. But this will be important also for the regulation, and the independent assurance will be very important, giving the information back to the regulator to meet the requirements of the standard. So there's normally two focus areas that they're going to be talking about as well. The first one is the focus on the asset, and that is to identify the potential threat on those valuable assets. The other one is focused on attackers, and that is look at security from a threat vector perspective, and then also focus on software. And that is, if an organization develops your own software, then it can also be considered a potential threat against the software. And that is where DevOps and DevSecOps are going to be very important. So what are the two questions we should be asking ourselves? So in the book, A Leader's Guide to Cybersecurity, they talk about the information assets and the security solutions. And on the information assets, it is what security solutions do you have in place to protect it? And on the security solutions, it is which business assets and processes does this protect? So if you're looking at the security controls, it can be things such as your security fabric topology. We can look from a Fortinet perspective on the FortiGate configuration. We can look at the security rating, score, and reporting, the management dashboard, and then also the NOC/SOC dashboard is going to be important from the security controls. And then looking at the audit and evidence perspective, that is where the analyzer and the FortiView will come in important. So again, reports will be important. Applications, risk and control is going to be important. Looking at admin and system events, and then also endpoint vulnerability capabilities to view that and have access to that is going to be important. So let's have a look at the key objective. The key objective is risk buy-down, and that is to minimize the risk, and it all should start with the plan and strategy. So we know that the board of directors will be held ultimately responsible, and these roles must be clearly defined. And when we look at the information security capability, we can see that this is focused on how to protect your data and your assets. And this is also applicable to third parties. So the security threat landscape is always changing, and these changes could have an impact on business, and would need to have controls in place to help mitigate these risks. Now, hey, listen, the one thing that's interesting is that the policy states that a policy framework should be followed. And they always pointed back also to the CIA, which is around the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So the ones I've marked in orange is not necessarily included directly in the policy, but it's also good practice to follow. So again, this is a very vague policy sometimes, but there are some clear controls that they are looking for. So the implementation would normally include other security controls, such as security policies and configuration management, but also on reporting is also focused on assurance to the board. So what are we then looking for when it comes to security controls? This is all around having controls in place that can help you with accountability and reports for the board. This is a common theme on the questions that the board of directors are asking. Are we secure, and how do we know it? So again, the CPS 234, these controls are around the remediation of the threats, controls to help to minimize the threat as much as possible. And this can be for physical and environmental controls, but this should also be integrated with change management. And controls can be, again, software, but it's also focused on data leakage. So when we briefly talked about the first point, and that is driven around the roles and responsibilities. So we're looking at number 2, the information security capabilities all around how to protect your data. And this is where NIST can come into play, and an important role where the CSF can help with the focus on identity, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And the third one here is the CPS is mentioning here again that the security policy framework should indicate the direction and responsibility of all parties, such as staff, contractors, consultants, related parties, third parties, and also customers. So again, the security controls is just to have all of those things together intact in place. Now, when we look at the security controls, the purpose is to make it difficult for the threat vector to exploit a vulnerability in a system or process. And of course, one of the components we need to include here is also risk management. But there's always 2 ways to do something, right? It is the wrong way and the right way. Now, the purpose is to make it very difficult for the threat vector to exploit the vulnerability in a system or process. And we know that performing an audit once a year is a recipe for failure. Too many things have changed. There's not enough time or resources to fix them all in one shot. So historically, security and compliance requirements has been an afterthought. And we've seen now that those things are busy being changed. And I believe that using CPS 234, that is a move in the right direction, where the board of directors will be held accountable. So why does the security policy include the components on its security controls, and why is this important? But hey, why does the policy include the components on security controls, and why is this important? We need to understand the nature of the controls, the relationship between those controls, and how to measure the effectiveness of these results. So what we need to do is to talk on the control categories. So that comes back to risk buy down, where you need to reduce your risk to an acceptable level. And you need to know your assets. What controls are they needed to reduce the risk on those assets? So here it is important to remember what are the controls needed that can help to manage the loss exposure. And those are things such as the system configuration, patching, password management, identity, access management, logging, backup, and recovery. Another component is around the variance controls. And that's going to include things such as the policies, the standards, awareness training, and remediation. And then we have the decision-making controls. We know that the board of directors will be held responsible. And the control is around those elements that enable the stakeholders to enforce their expectation, allocate resources to achieve their objective. And these things include things such as the organizational objectives, the laws and regulations, risk tolerance and definitions, the metrics reportings, and also the risk analysis. And we can always bring it back to the NIST framework that is all around the prevent, detect, and respond. So I find this quite interesting when looking at the FAIR approach from a framework perspective, risk framework perspective. So in the book, they talked about the control relationships. Of course, that if prevention was 100%, then from a control perspective is we needed nothing to respond about, and 0% detection would be in order of the day. But we know in the real world that is not possible. At the same time, for instance, if prevention was 0%, then if we had 100% response and 100% detection, then the controls would be perfect, right? But in the real world, let's have a look at another example. Let's say, what if the prevention is only 90% effective? For example, if only 10% of the fraud attempts are successful, this means that 10% of the time we have to detect the loss that an event occurred, and we then need to respond to it. If our detection and responses combined are 90% effective against 10% of those events, then combined the effectiveness is 99%. Also, when looking at the FAIR approach, what is the purpose of having controls? The purpose is to make it difficult for a threat vector to exploit a vulnerability in a system or process. And they're breaking it down into the human error scenarios or controls that can include training, documentation, simplification, or processes. But some of the controls also focus on remediation of threats, risk buy-down, physical controls or environmental controls, software controls or data leakage, and also change management. Another component that they're talking about in the report from the implementation is around incident management. So the base of incident management should be focused on the internal audit. So we're looking at ITIL. An incident is an unplanned interruption or a sudden reduction in the performance of an IT service, and an event is a slight change in the state of the system or service in the IT infrastructure. So we know there is a cost associated in having something, but there is also a cost associated in not having it. But what is the cost for business when looking at embracing incident management? Now, a report from Bonneman shows that the business could save over $1.2 million if they have an incident response team. And that is if the team is conducting extensive testing. It can lower the impact cost of a data breach. So here the policy focus on the why it is important to have mechanisms in place to detect and respond to incidents in a timely manner. One should also have a documented strategy in place on how to respond to the potential future incidents. And this should include the information security response plans, and this should include information around escalations and reporting information back to the board. This should also include the information such as who is responsible for the security incident management, and it is also important to ensure that this is reviewed annually. So this again is where the NIST framework is a recommendation to look at for this process. Escalation and reporting is also part of this process. So the regulation also talk about the internal requirements for the internal audit. It must assess the information security controls provided by third parties. Components that should include when looking at the assets are assess the risk, assess the potential threat event, and also have a look at the potential impact. Now there is also some interaction between CPS 232 and 234 notification. So under CPS 234, an APRA regulated entity must notify an APRA of information security incidents that meet specific criteria. And the Prudential Standard CPS 232 focus on business continuity management, and that includes the requirements also to notify APRA of disruptions that meet any specific criteria. Now the following component is all around reports. And I think what's quite important here is when looking at this, what they're looking for from an APRA notification. They're going to ask for things such as the name of the entity. They're going to look at things such as the date and time of the period of the incident. So they're going to look at when this was assessed. And important here around that is going to be around the incident type, the incident description, and then also the current status of the incident. They're going to also ask for information such as any mitigation that has been taken or any mitigation that is planned. So one of the other components is around the evidence of the testing techniques. So a couple of important things here will be around the network security. They will talk about information such as your zero trust. They will talk about your anti-malware. They will talk about network segmentation. They will talk about having your firewall in place. Make sure you've got encryption, all of those things in place. They also talk about least privilege. They talk about reporting, and then also about your recovery plans. So when it comes to reporting, what are some of the common information reports that a board of directors can use? So in here what they've done, they broke it down into things such as the capability. And the capability, they're going to talk about things such as the strategy, the situation awareness, the capability assessment, and also identify the capability gaps and status for remediation of activities. If we're looking at the incidents, then they will talk about the post-incident report for material incidents. They will talk about the incident trend analysis, that's for internal and external requirements. And they'll also talk about the incident response test results. And then if we look at controls, that'll be controls test activities. That'll be including the schedule, the scope, results, and trends. It will be internal audit activities. It will be progress on risk and remediation activities. They will look at the outcomes of vulnerable and threat assessments, third-party and related party assessments, and also information security policy frameworks and compliance reporting. Another component around there is also education, and they break that down into informational and awareness material, results of training and awareness sessions as well. They then broke that down into a couple of components on events and practices. And what I think is quite interesting is they broke this down into your pre-compromise, in your on-compromise, and also post-compromise. And what I'll do is I'll have this report in a format that you can download after the session as well. If you don't have this during this video, please send me an email and I can get this report out through to you. So one of the questions I do get quite often is, can we map Fortinet solutions to risk and regulation? And I think it's quite important to understand that the Fortinet Security Fabric can enable the risk monitoring and compliance. So one of the components that we will do is I'll just show an overview of how some of the capabilities and features of the fabric can help companies to meet the regulation and requirements. And this is a 5-step approach that provides a strategic outline on how customers can leverage the fabric investment to design best practices for risk monitoring and compliance. So step 1 is conduct a risk assessment of the current network, applications, and service environment. Step 2 would be segment and label all parts of the network to separate critical, compliance, and non-critical assets. So step 3 will be design and implement consistent access controls regardless of the type and location of the target asset and the resource or the source of the user. And step 4 is the fabric connectors provide seamless integration to networks, endpoints, user and applications outside of the on-premise environment. And then step 5 is maintain continuous monitoring and reporting of access and threat events. So again, a lot of those things is that we can map it back into the solutions where they will talk about network security, they talk about secure access, we can do that, endpoint protection all the way through the security operations to application security, and we again bring all of those back into our FortiGuard services where we can do our security rating, and that will help to understand your risk posture as well. So I just want to bring that back into the summary from a compliance and best practices. So again, compliance is a journey, it's not a final state. So many things change internally and externally. So you need to stay vigilant, monitor, and adjust continuously. So start with a good planning, focus on the most important assets, use a common method and measure and manage the risk, leveraging the frameworks and tools, and implement automation as you mature within your environment. And then also the security fabric and family of Fortinet products can help to drive many key enablers for customers along the compliance journey. Again, there's very different models that we can help you with from that. So from a basic to improve to optimal level, we've got solutions that can help you to grow within your environment. So one of the key components around there is around visibility. How do you do that? And we do that with our security rating, where we can give you visibility into Fortinet best practices that's based on the frameworks we just talked about, and we can also include that to things such as your PCI requirements. And again, we mentioned reporting, and that's really important for us to bring those things back into a way that you can give that back to the board of directors. So that's going to include things such as your compliance report, where you can look at your requirements such as your PCI. We can bring that back into your network overview, where you can look at things such as your internal segmentation, but we also bring that back where you can understand and have visibility into your data, how that moves and flows into your environment. And again, if we're talking about infrastructure as a service, we do have the security in there as well. We can leverage the CASB solutions for your multi-cloud compliance. And again, those things include your things such as SOX. It will include your PCI DSS, will include GDPR, and also the NIST and ISO security. And at the same time, we can integrate that for a multi-complex environments using our 40 SIEM solution, where we can bring in security from that perspective as well. But one of the other components I keep on hearing as well is, Cornelius, this is great, but where do we start? If we have the framework, do you have something you can share? And the answer for that is, of course, yes. So one of the things that we've seen customers are talking about is just the visibility that they have in here. And we can help them to say, what if you understand the articles of influence, the descriptions? What we've done from our side is we've mapped the Fortinet influencer to these requirements to simplify it and make it easier for you. We also look at the same thing when we looked at the MITRE ATT&CK framework, where we've mapped those tactics back to Fortinet solutions. And we've also done the same thing for your CIS control, but also your ASD top 8. So please reach out to me and I can help you with the documentation for those regulations to help you simplify that into your business environment. So just in summary, some key aspects to consider when building your CPS 234 strategy is having visibility into your security metrics that is meaningful when you do your business, assurance that it's in line with your business requirements and your security roadmap, and then also your compliance and regulation requirements. So the next steps is easy. Please reach out to your local representative and we can help you with your insight into building your security strategy. I am Cornelius Murray. Thank you so much for your time.